Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the afternoon session of today's webinar on population dynamics and social policy. My name is Jung-Hwa, and I am a professor at Department of Social Welfare at Seoul National University. We have 3 distinguished scholars for our panelists in this session, and I'm honored to introduce them: Dr. Alícia Adserà from Princeton University, Dr. Chulhee Lee from Seoul National University, and Dr. Feng Qiushi from National University of Singapore. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and we'll have discussion after hearing all 3 presentations. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat window in YouTube during the presentations. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Alícia Adserà. Dr. Adserà is a senior scholar at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, a lecturer in economics and international affairs at Princeton University. Her research focuses on fertility and household formation and migration and international political economy. She will talk about educated women, the transformation of the labor market, and future of fertility. So, Dr. Adserà, please.
Good afternoon. Let me see. Let me share. Here we go. Is it good? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here and for this chance to speak to this audience. The topic was very broad and I had to choose something. So what I'm going to show is going to be a little bit of some basic points of discussion, and I'm happy to continue the conversation in Q&A. The topic is broad, so it's very hard to really capture the whole thing in 20 minutes. So let me start with 3 slides of share some basic data. So when we think about fertility in the world, there are differences in fertility rates across the world, but they have been converging. We only have really nowadays above replacement rate, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, in some areas of Africa and Western Asia, but it's really the stubbornness of sub-Saharan Africa that remains. Otherwise, the other regions are below replacement rate mostly. This has some implications on what is going to be the composition of continental population across the next decades. What you see is really a rising increase in African population as a weight into the world population. And then Asia, that has always been the largest continent, is slowly taking less weight, but there's huge heterogeneity still within Asia. The last point, just as a motivation, is we want to focus on who is really aging, which is part of this story. We have especially East Asia, so here we have Korea and Japan, and Southern Europe, Italy and Spain, and this is the share of population age 65 plus. And this is the result of a combination of very rising life expectancy, extremely low fertility, and in the case of East Asia, of low immigration, something I will touch upon in this conversation. So I'm going to focus in the conversation now on low fertility settings. And I'm just going to go over some basic points. All of them are going to be really 1 or 2 slides as just the motivation of the main ideas. And then if I have time, I will touch a bit about sub-Saharan Africa. Otherwise, this is something I'm happy to talk afterwards. So let me focus especially on low fertility settings and on the changes of education and gender imbalances. And why are they important? So what we've observed during the last decades is a huge rise in female educational attainment. So what we have now is, in this graph, you have some European countries, and you have the tertiary education attainment of people who are in their early 30s. And you can really see that more women than men have tertiary education in many of these countries. This means that most of these women are more informed, they have access to contraception, they have much more higher aspirations in the labor market. And also this is going to change the marriage matching, how people are thinking about their unions. Another important thing, which I have already written a bit, and I think it's very important, is that we have to think that there's potentially a change in the selection of who's now educated. We always thought about educated as some of the women who are a bit the outliers. And now, if anything, the majority of women are educated, there's a larger share of the population who's educated. And in terms of the preferences, if we think about who wants more or less children, the more representative women in society is going to be a highly educated women. So we have to take this into account. There's going to be changes in selection in this sense. And more likely, these women may have more high preferences. And that's what you really observe in a cross-country setting. So this graph comes from Rita Testa. And in the first one, you see the share of women with high education in a country. And then the mean ultimate size of family intended. In the other, you say the share of high women with high levels of educated and the actual family share across Europe. And in a quantitative way, in fact, what you really see is that high intentions in countries with high education, and there's actually within Europe, in this case, mean family size is high in places with high education. And as I will argue, this is related to institutional change in labor markets, in part. More women want more children what they have. And this is actually something shown, especially in Europe. In these graphs, you have some countries with the 3 levels of education. So you have low, medium, and high. And the bars is the amount of children these women have of this particular cohort born in the early 60s. And the little dots in black are how many they wanted. So you always observe a gap. So it's not telling you that low fertility is necessarily driven by women, at least in some of these countries, wanted fewer children. Of course, childlessness is a problem among high educated. One of the things going on at the same time with these changes of education is changes in economic conditions and a restructuring of the labor market in these countries. There's a huge literature, and I cannot really now go over it. I recommend a summary paper by Sobotka and co-authors that show in general fertility to be procyclical. These are 2 graphs in the case of Spain, the country I was born to, that you can really see a roller coaster with unemployment and fertility working in opposite directions. I have done quite a bit of work on that, showing that during recent decades, short and long-term unemployment especially, and the increase of short-term contracts and a lot of temporary work have hurt fertility. And actually, this has been differentially impacting educational levels, with the less educated being the most hurt. In the US, during the Great Recession, we observed exactly the same, with the largest decreases in births among the least educated, and especially among the least educated or mid-educated men. This is a literature rising that's about the unmarriageable men, or the men with very low type of jobs. So that may lead to actually a convergence in fertility levels, as those lowest educated individuals are the highest hurt. So what's going on in this market? Why is this happening? An important thing that is happening in this market is a large restructuring in the market. This is a graph that comes from David Otto's work, looking at what types of jobs are disappearing and what types of jobs are thriving. He differentiates between low, middle, and high-paying jobs by sectors. And what this graph shows clearly in these more red lines is those jobs that are disappearing were those relatively good jobs in middle-paid occupations, and there's a widening of the distribution and a loss of the jobs in the middle. The loss of the jobs in the middle is actually affecting women, middle-educated and some high-educated women a lot. So would this structural change in the labor market lead to convergence in fertility across education levels? Who is hurt the most? Well, you observe that these high-tech increases in overall productivity may have complementarities with education, and in fact, they are leading to these increases across education, and that's why we are seeing the widening of the distribution inequality. The routine jobs in the middle, like the assistant, the secretary, the travel agent person, all these jobs are gone and they are disappearing. And some people are really relegated now to odd shifts for low educated, or the outsourcing leads to more unstable contracts. Only more educated women can maybe able to negotiate more flexible workplace or work in sectors that you can remotely work. And this is something that many papers have shown in the COVID. In the COVID, you can really see this exacerbation of this inequality on who was able to continue working, who had to be present, and who was able to negotiate arrangements. So the bottom line is more difficult for low middle educated men and women to sustain good jobs, many people returning to parental homes in Western Europe and in the US, for example, and that may be leading to convergence in fertility. Another thing that it's affecting women and their education is the gender wage gap. And we cannot forget about that. This is a very nice graph from a paper by Claudia Golding, looking at once you control for everything else, you have full-time university graduates or high educated women, you are taking into account their hours and educations, and you still see a pervasive gender gap. And in fact, if you see it in the life cycle, when they are 20, the gap is relatively small, but when they are in childbearing age, the gap is very large. So that is really affecting women who have aspirations in the labor market and high educated to really think about fertility. So the question is, why is this happening? Well, this is happening for different reasons. Well, you can think that even once you control for hours of work and full-time, these women are self-selecting in works that are more family-friendly. But these works may be not good works in terms of promotions and may be affected by some types of field of study. They may be on humanities, they may be on healthcare, on education, that tend to have lower wages. Also, many women, especially in Europe, shelter in the public sector. Nordic women just go to the public sector. 2/3 of people in Nordic countries among women work in protected sectors, in protected jobs in the public sector, but this is nice in terms of higher fertility. This is nice in terms of lower gap between intentions and actual number of children, but these are relatively lower paying jobs compared to other sectors, and women somehow feel relegated in those jobs. Some of them are linked to teaching and healthcare. I have done some analysis, and this is actually from the late 90s, but there's some recent work also looking at something similar, but I thought this graph was very telling. You can see how the type of sector where you are may affect your likelihood to have another birth. And this is transition among 13 European countries of whether women go to produce a second baby or a third baby, depending on the sector where they are. And this is relative of women who are inactive. So we always think women who are outside the labor force may be the ones who are going to be having more babies. If anything, what you see here is those who are in public sectors, and in some cases part-time in public sectors, are the ones in Europe who actually are much more likely to have another baby. That doesn't mean, as I will argue at the end, that we want all women in the public sector. If anything, what we really want as a policymaker is consider which are the features of those jobs that will enable these women to have those babies, and then maybe translate some of those in other types of sectors. One important thing that people don't really focus much is that, okay, women work fewer hours, we know that. We know that fertility stands not just for childbirth, but in fact child rearing. So you really have to be many years taking care of the children. You tend to work part-time in less flexible jobs and less hours. But hours, once you control for hours, hours per se are not enough. One important feature in some cases is that hourly wage is going to vary with hours of work. So people who put more intensity and more hours are going to get a higher hourly wage rate, especially in higher end jobs. This is, for example, again, from a paper from Claudia Golding, showing high non-linearity in the wage profiles among law professionals. So women or men who work more hours in the law firms tend to make more per hour. So that's also another piece of information that's explaining the wage gap, not only the sector, but also the fact that there's no linearities in the wage gap. So that's all leading to the fact that then women with high aspirations are going to be concerned about just exiting the labor market. Finally, and not least important, is that this labor market instability is affecting men. And it's questioning the role of men as breadwinners, for example, in the context of East Asia. And that's actually very important for what's going to happen in union formation. And it's also increasing household inequality as assortative mating is happening more and more with the increases of education of women. So going to the impact of this instability of men as breadwinners, this has a huge impact in union formation. union formation is affected nowadays by gender imbalances, by the fact that men may not want to marry with more educated women or vice versa. There's a big literature in Europe. This is happening more and more. So that's an important research agenda of how to combat, how to handle gender imbalances in marriage market. In some contexts, there are still very rigid gender roles, and there's low acceptance of non-marital birth. So you can really see here the proportion of non-marital births in 2018, and you see at the corner East Asian countries, while in Europe, non-marital births and cohabitation are accepted, but economic conditions have led to huge postponement of stable partnership formation that is also affecting births. So marriage seems to be key for East Asia. This is from a paper by Jones showing increases in the percentage of singles among women aged 30 to 34 across the East Asian countries. And only we are observing now small increases in shares of premarital cohabitation. So if marriage is key for fertility, what's going on with marriage? Well, there are many factors influencing marriage and union formation. There's work pressures, housing affordability, the traditional parental in-law figure in some contexts, and then the importance of high perceived cost for marriage for couples and women. The wedding ceremony, but very importantly, the idea of raising a successful child and the idea of having to put lots of resources on raising this successful child. And for the point of view of high educated women, loss of freedom and independence because of work culture and the fact that men do very little. We are starting to see some university educated women exhibiting second demographic transition in East Asia also, in addition to the huge prevalence of those features already across Europe. So what to do and why is this a problem? Well, I guess some people have already spoken about aging. So we've seen the aging of these populations, we've seen the postponement. Well, there are different policies that one could address. One could boost fertility rates or marriages. In East Asia, marriages policies have been important, but we've seen there's been a lot of failed policies. Another option is just go for labor productivity. I mean, an increase in the amount of women working in the labor market should increase production per se, and also should improve the support ratios. But another option is migration. And migration, of course, leads to rejuvenation of population, to improvement in support ratios, but it has its problems. So I've worked a lot on migration. And of course, this is a complicated policy, and especially in contexts where this has not been still considered. In general, the data show positive fiscal impacts across second generations. It can lead or not to women in the labor market integrating. So if we really make sure that migrant men and especially women integrate in the labor market, that will be successful. But that per se may be self-defeating as women really then integrate and decrease their fertility. And that's part of what we've seen. There's a huge evidence of migrant fertility convergence, which means this is not a long-term policy sustainable in terms of just letting some people in and thinking that these are going to be replenishing the population. And finally, a huge problem may be a backlash from natives via, in fact, downsizing or excluding non-natives in the welfare state, or the rise of populism or protectionism. So it's not a clean policy, but it's actually maybe one of the good policies that we have at hand, but it has pros and cons. So what can public policy do? Well, we've seen that generally there's been fair fertility and marriages policies in low fertility settings. If anything, it has affected the timing maybe of childbearing, but not necessarily the quantum of fertility. A key thing seems to be to level the playing field for women, as these women are more educated in a broad sense, to take full advantage of their skills. We have to think now that women are going to have fewer kids, life expectancy is increasing, and they have high education. So that's a potential really to tap in as a country in terms of longer potential careers. And so there's a need to adapt labor market institutions to the demands of these highly educated women, but not only be a public sector or highly regulated sectors. It's important to try to go beyond that and rethink the policy And finally, there's importance in expanding work life to take advantage of lower morbidity and the stock of large work skills among older individuals. That's something I was reading in the Wall Street Journal last week about the new classifications of who is old in Japan now. I mean, all these now, people who are in their 70s are not considered very old. Now it's beyond 70. So is this also an opportunity in terms of productivity enhancement of the society? There's also three key issues that I just want to mention for future population dynamics that we don't have to forget. Postponement leads to fecundity challenges, which go with reproduction techniques and ethical issues. So that's an important thing to think about. The role of social media as a place of matching and source of information that may be affecting individuals in an unequal way. And then not least is climate change. Climate change has the double edge. On one end, there's this idea of non-linearities on impact of population in climate change with thresholds and feedback effects that tell us population should slow down. But also at the same time, if the goal is really worry about this aging, it may be affecting and impacting preferences towards lower fertility. So that's an important thing. And I think I'm out of time mostly, but just let me tell you one note on Africa. So why Africa may be an interesting thing to consider. We know there's high fertility. We know that there may be economic development jumping states. So maybe in these places, they're going to not have manufacturing in the same way we have in other Western countries. And this young population is an opportunity. And on itself, it may be an opportunity for the countries themselves, as they may reverse development on their impact on fertility and slow down through the importation of norms, social norms, and women's empowerment brought about by the migrants themselves, which may speed up the decrease in fertility. So with that, I'm going to close my presentation.
Thank you, Professor Adserà, for your insightful presentation. I think your presentation speaks a lot to Korea, which is dealing with low fertility and rapidly aging population. So I hope we can discuss this at the end during the panel discussion. Now, let me introduce our second speaker, Dr. Chulhee Lee. Dr. Lee is a professor of economics here at Seoul National University. His major research topics are economic status and labor market behaviors of older persons and interactions of ecological environment, socioeconomic status, and health over the life course. The title of his presentation is Technological Change, Job Characteristics, and Employment of Aged Workers, Evidence from Korea. So, Dr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Compared to Alícia's presentation, my presentation focused on a very small topic. Actually, that was related to the final, the point made by Alícia regarding the expanding work life as a response to the challenge of the population aging. And my people will ask the question whether it will be possible and what is the labor market background of extending work life of the elderly people in Korea. So let me begin with the oops. Sorry. Okay. Let me begin with the background of this study. And it is well known that the effect of current technological change is symbolized by AI and automation is an important question among labor economists. And there are debates, are ongoing as to whether newly invented machines would change human labor and what kind of jobs would be especially vulnerable to the effect of technological change. But it should be noted that the effect of technological change may be different by the type of workers. For instance, marginal workers, such as elderly labor, could be more severely affected by technological change. However, there are not many studies empirically studying this topic, and there's no empirical evidence has been suggested for South Korea. So in this study, I examine how the adoption of the new technology affect employment of South Korean workers in general, and how it affect elderly people and young workers differentially. And let me give you some explanation for the conceptual framework of this study. Any technological change is expected to have the two different types of effect on the labor market. At first, it affects labor productivity and work organizations, and in turn influence the demand for old labor. I mean, demand the relative demand as well as absolute demand for the old labor. But on the other hand, it also changes work conditions such as speed and flexibility of work, as well as requirement for human capital. And this changes the quality of matching between the worker and the job. And let me give you an example. And the number shows the average retirement ages in different sports. And how do we explain the differences? One possible way is that the requirement needed in each sport in terms of the physical strength, agility, and stamina may differ across different sports. So even if the player is matched well with the sport at younger ages, as they get older, the quality of matching between the two it deteriorates. And the speed depends on the features of each sport. For instance, in figure skating, from very early ages, players, it is very difficult for the players to keep up with the effect of aging. But in professional golf, it is relatively easy for the players, coupled with the effect of aging. So the point is that if the technology changes, for instance, in figure skating, now they need to perform the quadruple jump in the sport, it becomes even more difficult for the players to cope up with the effect of the aging. Okay. And I just explained that there are two different effects, productivity and matching effect. And these two effects may be different across different type of workers, depending on their health, human capital, and preference. And I believe, on average, it is likely that the effect of technological change in employment would be less favorable for aged workers than for young workers for the following reasons. First of all, aged workers tend to have obsolete skills and knowledge, and there's disadvantage in learning new technology. And secondly, their expected return to investment in training is lower compared to that of young people. And also they are more likely to be affected strongly by any changes in work environment caused by technological changes. So I want to study how the episode of adopting new technology affect employment of elderly workers. And to do so, I need to have the data that contain information on both technological change adopted by particular firms and the employment of individual workers in the firms. It is quite difficult to find such data, but we managed to find firm level panel data that were linked to administrative employment insurance record in Korea. To be more specific, the workplace panel survey conducted by the Korean Labor Research Institute provide information on the establishment, including the variables on the workplace innovations, organizations, and so on. And the Korean employment insurance record matched with this panel data provide information on the wages and labor market transitions and personal characteristics of individual workers who had been employed in the sample firm at least once. Okay. And I used the following measures of technological change that are available from the data. And 2015 survey provide information on the automations based on the question of whether the firm put new automation process into practice by 2015. And also it provide information on the investment in IT technology and investment in IT hardware. I use these three indices of technological change. And 2015 survey included about 3,400 forms in the survey. And the linked data, the data linked with the insurance record, include about a million people. The sample selection is the following. I selected people who had been employed in the firm at the beginning of 2015 and who were aged 25 to 69 in 2015. And I also selected firms with 10 or more employees because the small size firms are quite different in terms of, and there's no, not many the small firms that adopted the technological innovations. And individuals aged 50 and older were defined as old workers, but I also used various cutoff ages in the analysis. And I follow up the individuals who were employed in 2015 to 2017 and how their employment status changes over time. Okay. And this is the model I used in estimations. I used the Cox proportional hazard model and include the variables on old workers, the variables regarding old workers, which is denoted by A, and also variables on technological change, which is T, and also include the interaction term between the two. So the variable of my interest is the beta one, which is the coefficient for the interaction terms, which shows whether the effect of technological change in a firm was more favorable or less favorable for aged workers compared to the young. And in this estimation, I also the control for the personal characteristics such as age, gender, job tenure, and whether they are exposed to they're subject to extended retirement age in Korea, which began in 2013. And I also include a set of firm characteristics such as size, the revenue, and industry. And one concern is that adopting new technology is endogenous, especially endogenous to changing demand for labor. To alleviate these problems, we estimated the two-stage digital inclusion estimation using two instrumental variables, which is related to adopting technology, but not necessarily related to demand for labor. The two IV include small group activities for innovations and code of conduct regarding the internet use. I skipped the explanation for these variables. Okay, let me show you the baseline result. And the coefficient is the hazard ratio. So if it is greater than 1, it indicates that this variable actually increases the hazard of retirement by 2015. If it is under 1, then it indicates that it reduced the hazard of retirement by 2015. As you can see, for 3 measures of technological change, the estimated coefficient for the technological index itself, like new automation and investment in IT equipment, is under 1 and is statistically significant. It indicates that adopting new technology itself, the reduced the hazard of retirement among incumbent workers by 2015. In other words, it has favorable effect on employment of overworkers. But on the other hand, the coefficient for the interaction term is greater than 1 and statistically significant. It shows that adopting new inventions is less favorable for aged workers compared to the young. And if we multiply these two the indices, we end up with the overall effect on employment of older workers. I mean, if it is less than 1, then the overall employment effect is positive. But if it is greater than 1, it is negative for the older workers. And I found that the let me show you this baseline result. I already covered the first two point, and I found that the overall effect of automation on aged workers' employment is actually positive. In other words, it reduces the hazard of job separation absolutely. Although it increased the hazard relatively to the young. However, the adoption of IT investment actually increases the hazard of job separation of aged workers absolutely, as well as relative to the young workers. In other words, if we select some particular measures of technological change, it has negative effect on the employment of old workers. Okay, then I chose different the cutoff ages for the older ages. In the baseline regression, the cutoff age was 50. And as for the new automations, as the cutoff ages increases, the coefficient for interaction term increases in magnitude. That means as the workers get older, the relatively negative effect of adopting the new automation becomes greater across ages. But on the other hand, investment in IT technology in general and IT equipment for these measures, the coefficient for the interaction term is quite stable, regardless of the choice of the cutoff ages. Okay. Okay, let me summarize the result. As I just showed you, technological change tend to lower the hazard of retirement of overall workers. But the adoption of new technology tend to increase the hazard of job separation among aged workers as compared to the young persons. And in some cases, although I did not give you the detailed result on the heterogeneity and sensitivity test, the technological change tend to increase the hazard of job separation of aged workers absolutely in particular sectors and particular type of workers, greatly. For instance, the effect is stronger for aged males who are engaged in manufacturing industry. Such an effect of technological change is much weaker for female workers compared to the effect on the male workers. And we also found that the investment in IT and the purchase of IT equipment absolutely increased the retirement hazard of aged workers employed in service industry. Okay, let me wrap up my presentation. The evidence I just showed you here may not represent the overall effect of technological change. I only examined the effect of three indices of technology, namely automations, investment in IT technology, and investment in IT equipment. And I believe a certain type of new technology may be helpful for the extending the work life of aged workers, such as any technology that help work at home, remote work, or work at home, and some other techniques that alleviate the disadvantage of the aged workers. Okay. But however, as this study suggests, some of the common types of recent technological changes, including the automation and investment in IT, may bring unfavorable labor market consequences for the aged people, at least compared with the young. And so in some cases, it may reduce the employment of elderly workers, absolutely. So in this sense, technological change may bring additional challenges for the rapidly aging society. Because one of the challenges is to increase labor's participation rate among the elderly people in response to the decrease in the working population. But any types of this kind of effort will face the challenges of technological change. Okay, I stop my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for a very interesting presentation. As a layperson, I always thought that technologies would take jobs from workers, but I guess I was wrong. I was quite surprised to find that overall effect of automation is actually positive for both young and older workers. So thank you for the informative presentation. And let me introduce our last speaker. Our last speaker is Dr. Feng Qiushi from National University of Singapore. Dr. Feng is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and deputy director of Center for Family and Population Research at US. He has conducted extensive research in the fields of aging and health, population studies, and economic sociology. Today, he will talk about application of ProFamy in the projection of household and living arrangement. Dr. Feng, please.
Thank you, Jung-Hwa. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer, Professor Bong and Professor Jung-Hwa for this invitation. And I'm very pleased to present some of my research for this webinar. My presentation is titled Application of ProFamy in the Projection of Household and Living Arrangement. First of all, I'm very inspired by Professor Adserà and Professor Lee talking about the different issues on population transformation. And it is very right that our world is under a great transformation in terms of demography. I would like to point out another layer in this transformation, that is the transformation of household. And actually, comparing with the growth and transformation of population, the other side, the household, how people live with each other, has been also changing very rapidly. As you can see from the statistics, for a long period of time, the increase of number of households has been much more rapid in household than the growth of population. And this is simply because no matter how population is declining or increasing, and people are living in smaller household size. And that's why the increase of household is much more faster than population change. And in regard to policy implication, that actually has a huge outcome because most of the consumable energy or service or commodities are usually purchased and consumed by the household rather than the individuals. And in that regard, a smaller household size is not a blast for the sustainable development because that will mean a higher per capita resource consumption by each of the people. So to illustrate this, we think for thinking about the future energy consumption and also the the consumables, such as the vehicle, the housing, we really need to go back to the unit of analysis as a household rather than population. And this is an illustration Professor Zheng did recently for Hebei province in China. We can see if we use population as the unit of analysis, instead of using household, we will have a very large underestimate for the future consumption of the energy in terms of electricity, the water, and the fuel. So by saying this today, I would like to show a newly developed method and also to illustrate its application in different domains. And this new method has actually been developed by the 1990s. It has been so far applied to many, many countries. In the literature, there are 3 groups of projection method for household. Number 1 is the traditional used headship rate, which is still very popular for the statistic agencies. And the second method is the micro-simulation, which is agent-based, which has been adopted in some European countries. And then the third one is ProFamy, represented by ProFamy, which is the micro-simulation. The issue is the micro-simulation will be very much limited by the data requirement. And people will need to develop a very refined data set about the transition rate. In this regard, the advantage of ProFamy is it is micro-simulation, and based on a group of people, it is also cohort component method. In that way, it could be easily, based on the conventional available demographic data to do the projection. And this method has been extensively validated both in the United States and in China, not only in the national level, but also in the provincial level. And currently, it has been applied in 27 countries, and the World Bank, and also the UNPD. We list some of the literatures for you to see, how this method has been applied in different scenarios and different countries. And today, I'm going to talk about 2 recent developments of this method, and also I would like to illustrate, how can we use this method to inform the policymakers about the future dynamics of population and household. The first one, I would like to illustrate application of ProFamy at the county level. Actually, since the 1990s, projection study at subnational level become more and more important because many planning activity for the policymaker or business analyst should be targeting on the subnational level rather than the entire national level. And that's why there's a growing demand to tell what will be the future scenario of household and population for a small area or small region. However, the subnational data are usually very limited. So how can we methodologically address this to help do such projection? For ProFamy method, we develop a core hypothesis. In the usual ProFamy projection, we need 3 elements. First of all, we need a baseline population. Second of all, we will need a schedule index to describe the basic transition of the major demographic events. And thirdly, we will need the demographic summary measures to regulate the change of population household. And for the subnational level, we raise a hypothesis that we think the subnational level schedules should be reasonably assumed to be same as the national level, such as the age-specific transition rate of marriage, fertility, death, mortality, and the rate of adult children leaving home. And on the other hand, If this assumption is reasonable, we could use the summary measures from the local agency, and that will greatly facilitate the application of ProFamy at the subnational level. Southern California Association of Governments is officially agency in charge of 6 counties in Southern California. It is the largest metropolitan area of the United States. And it is also a good case for us to apply the ProFamy. We first of all, worked with the local agency and try to validate the method. Namely, we are using the historical data of 2000 and try to project the household and population in 2010. In this kind of simulation, both the starting point and the ending point actually observe the data. And we compare our projection result with the observed data in 2010. As you can see, the arrows are quite small. After that, we firstly project the change of population size and number of households in the 6 counties of Southern California, including the county of Emporio, Los Angeles, county of Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura. As you can see, in the next, by the year of 2040, all the counties will have a major increase in terms of population and household. But obviously, the increase of household numbers are actually more substantial than the increase of the population. And the reason is because of the smaller household size. Not only that, we further project how many, the household size, and then the basic type of household. These have significant policy implications because those household size will be highly relevant to housing, consumption of durable consumptions, electricity consumption, and transportation. And as you can see, we observe a declining average household size, and we see a declining trend of the married couple with co-residing children in this region, a slight increase of 1-person household. We can further provide race-specific result because immigration is a top issue for Southern California. And as we can see, for the non-Hispanic Black people, the percentage of only 1-person household increased dramatically. On the other hand, the non-Hispanic other, most of them will be Asian, will be kind of featured by the dominance of married couple. And one of the important issues is population aging, as 2 of our speakers has been highlighted. We further project for the older people living in Southern California, if they are aged over 65 and over, what will be their living arrangement? These projections will be very useful for the local policymakers to see the future demands of elderly care. Of course, we can further add disability to make it more direct. But here, I give you a very rough estimation of different kind of living arrangement of Southern California older adults. And based on this, the local government will have good intelligence to do the planning. We could also further differentiate this by different marital status. And this is a projection of the solo living older people. As you may see, for the older adults, those who live without any spouse and children are usually the main target of social welfare. We would like to project the different trend of this group. And more importantly, we specify this group of people by race and marital status. It is very clear that the majority of solo liver in Southern California will be made up of the non-Hispanic whites. And the other, and then most of them are widowed women. And later you will find the divorced female white and widowed male whites. These are the dominating groups who are living alone over age 65. For the other races such as Black, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic people, solo living is not substantial as compared with the white people. In regard to the solo living, I would like to further go along this line to talk about another application of ProFamy for China. We did this as a team to project the solo living people, which is a very special type of household in China. And I believe which is also a very interesting demographic trend worldwide, particularly I think in South Korea and Japan. I read some news report about how young people kind of choose to live alone without any family member. Anyway, I mean, this is a worldwide trend. Actually, 1/3 of, in many European countries, 1/3 of the total household has been made up of those solo livers. And worldwide, 4 out of top 10 are now in Asia. However, this group of solo livers are very different. And they could be people who are with very high education and choose to live alone for better privacy and better later life. And it could also be the widowed woman without any social support and with very disadvantaged economic status. In China, in the past 20 years, the Chinese proportion of solo livers actually tripled, increased from 17 million to 58 million in 2010. And then the question will be, we realize the increase of those solo livers, but who are they? Who are the solo livers in China? How about their gender, their age, their residence, marital status, education, and health? Without understanding all these demographics, policymakers cannot make proper plannings in face of this very challenging trend of population and household dynamics. Using ProFamy, we modeled from 2010 to 2015. And this is a working manuscript led by Professor Jung-Hwa. And we can see very clearly the Chinese solo livers currently in 2010 only make up about 15%, which is lower than the 3-generation household in 2010, the traditional Asian type of family. At that time, 18% of Chinese family are with 3 generations, and 40% are 2 generations with a married couple. But in 2050, the 3-generation family is almostly gone. Only 4% of them will live with 3 generations. And 1-person household will increase to about 20%. This is a huge demographic change for the Chinese government. We further model this by different age and gender. As you can see, the first 2 graphs at the upper panel actually is the rural area of China. And then the lower panel represents urban. They have different scales. As you can see for the rural area, because the rapid urbanization trend in China, and the total change is not significant. The shape has been concentrated on the old age. Therefore, the solo living older adults in rural China will be a big problem in 2050. In urban area, however, we can see a very substantial increase for both the old age and the young age. If we go further to understand these groups, you can see more clearly if we specify the marital status. As you can see, for the big jump of urban solo livers in China, most of them live alone because they do not get married, the red color. And then for the rural area, most of the solo livers are because of widowhood. We further put in two major human capital indicators. One is education. As you can see, the solo livers in China, especially the youth, are highly educated. And in terms of disability, you can see clearly that in the rural area, many solo livers indeed are unhealthy in terms of ADL disability, and thus substantially need the social welfare to help. Thank you very much. And CIPR at AUS is going to hold the second international conference on projection of household and living arrangement in January of next year, in cooperation with Peking University, UNPD, UNPFA, and also Population Association of Singapore and Chinese Population Development Research Center. And then if you're interested, you're very welcome to join us to think further about the future scenario of household living arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Feng, for informative presentation. Your presentation really helps us see the one-person household from many different perspectives. You introduced us to many layers like urban-rural differences, young-old population differences, and ADL and education. And it was really interesting, and I think it has many implications for policy development in the future. So now we are going to I'm going to read to you some questions that we got from our audience, and there are really many questions for each of you. So let me read them, and you can choose which one to answer, or you can provide a general comment. So let me start with questions for Dr. Adserà. One person said, you earlier mentioned that more women in Africa are becoming educated. How long do you think it will take for more women in Africa being educated, reflected in the labor market of Africa? And the second question is, what changes in the labor market do you believe would motivate women to return to the labor market once they have given childbirth? And the third question is, how long do you think it will take for the tradition of women being the one to stay at home and men being the one to work change? And the fourth question is, if we allow free migration for women, which country do you think women would travel most to? This is very interesting. Fifth question, what do you think about parental leave at work? Do you think it has been effective with respect to reduce childcare burden of working parents? And the last comment is, one of education, culture, and economic backgrounds. Out of education, culture, and economic backgrounds, which do you think has affected the low fertility rate of Korea the most?
Sorry, should I proceed, or you're going to?
Yeah, could you proceed?
Explain the questions for everybody? Because you went so fast. There was some of them. I'm sorry, I missed some of them. So
okay.
I can try to go to some of some. Yeah, no, I'll try some, but okay, so let me try to see the ones I managed to capture, and I don't want to take too much time. So, okay, so with respect to Africa, I mean, Africa is very heterogeneous, okay? So it's very difficult to answer this in a very generic way. One thing I wanted to mention, first it was this heterogeneity. You can see huge differences across the continent, especially if you think about the north and the south compared to the center, and part that's related to economic development of the countries, and in part is related to how stable their political institutions are. And that's one important part that's going on in Africa, is whether you have ongoing wars or lack of political leadership, that's actually hurting educational investments, and in general, health investments, access to family planning. So I would say answering generically for Africa, it's very hard. One interesting thing is that there's actually what I was mentioning about this reverse development, if you may, from the transnational migrant. You observe, for example, within Africa, places that traditionally send migrants, for example, to Europe, so let's say North Africa, Morocco, compared to places that send migrants to areas more in the Middle East, where the destination places have different patterns of fertility and of empowerment of women. That's also reverting and affecting their countries of origin a lot. And if you see the speed at which, for example, fertility rates are dropping in Morocco, it's way faster than they are falling, for example, in Egypt. And part of that may be this, two-way direction of development in the information and the transmission of social norms or information in general about new patterns of families. So that's one potential question, and that's going to affect education. About this free migration, where women will go, well, this is a very big question. I have some papers looking at decisions, and actually now working with a data set that we just collected with a colleague in Munich on tertiary, on university students in different countries from Mexico, India, and several European countries, trying to see where people would like to go. The heterogeneity is large. In general, people tend to go to places where they think the returns are going to be higher, but also it depends on whether they are more or less risk averse, and they look for places where there's wider or lower inequality in destination. Generally, of course, the most popular destinations are the US and then Europe in general in our samples. So that's not necessarily surprising, but also it depends more importantly on the network. An important thing that people don't recognize is that half of the migration in the world happens to what we call south to south migration. So it's happening a lot within developing countries themselves. So it's very hard to answer this question. I don't know that. I'm trying to keep a little bit. Parental leave, I think it has helped, and it definitely helps in the context of a little bit this thought about a longer thought on helping women plan for their careers, the assurance that they can come back. I think it's important, and it comes normally more with a package of which are really the guarantees that the women face, but also incorporating men in the parental leave. This has been pretty successful in, for example, Nordic countries or German-speaking countries in Europe. In some cases, though, it has backlash into maybe men taking, for example, there's papers in Spain looking at men taking the first parental leave and then not having any more babies. So it's a little bit of a complicated, whether it's the men or the women, but I think it does help. And I'm trying to see the other ones. I didn't understand the one on education culture. I didn't understand the last one. You were too fast, and I'm sorry. But maybe I can leave the other people answer, and then I can go back to those. I don't want to take more time first. Oh.
Yeah, I sent you all the questions, but I guess we have only 10 minutes left. So
yeah, I think you should leave the others first. And then,
let's move on to the questions for Dr. Lee first, and then we'll come back if we have time. Yes. Dr. Lee, I also shared questions for you. I guess to save time, maybe it's better for you to read the questions and choose which one to answer. Have you got the questions? Or should I introduce?
Okay.
So for our audience, maybe I'll just try to read them while you read. So first question, in the next 20 years, how much of the labor market do you think will be substituted by artificial intelligence? And do you think artificial intelligence will take part in the sporting industry? If so, which sport do you think will be hit the hardest? Do you think we should deliberate? Should you go ahead? I mean, will you go ahead?
Okay, and it's a too big and difficult question for me to answer, actually. So I'm not in a position to give detailed answer to the question. But my response is that it will all depends on the change in labor market and the wages and demand and supply conditions of the workers. Because the technological change will take place in sectors where the wages increases very rapidly, and where there is, the sort of incentive to, replace workers by the new technology. Even if there is, technology available do that, if it is not profitable, the technology will not be adopted by the firm. So it all depends on the conditions of the labor market. And second point is that it is not my point. It is the point made by David Alter. And he suggests that over the last 50 years, he doesn't believe that the human labor will be replaced by the new technology such as AI as in the last 50 years. He pointed out that even 50 years ago, that was 1960s, people worried about that the human labor would be replaced by the new technology, and they would need to have basic incomes for the people who would be replaced by the technology. But it did not happen in the last 50 years. And he suggests that even though we don't have any good evidence to the project future, still human labor will be quite scarce, the inputs over the last 50 years. He has his point, and I believe that it is too early that the technological change would radically replace human labor in the foreseeable future. Okay.
Thank you. Let me move to questions for Dr. Feng. So I sent them to you as well.
Yes, I saw it. Thank you, Jung-Hwa. Thank you very much. A very interesting question. Thank you. And I think the first question is about, in the real energy consumption, there's outliers that some people consume too much and some people consume too little. I'm not an expert for this, but I do believe that in the future, for the household energy studies, and the researchers will have, and the policymakers will have more AI-based protocols. For example, the monitoring, the hot water consumption at what time, and also sending out the signals for like you are spending more than average. All these kind of new technologies, I think will help to address those issues partially. My second question is about what do I think about the future energy policy due to the population trend. I think I would like to tell the simple truth that is, regardless of population decline or increase, the increase of number of household will be there for a foreseeable future. In that case, the per capita energy consumption will definitely be worse. And that means we really need to be more careful to base on the policy, the energy policies based on the unit of analysis as household rather than population. And the third question is about the ProFamy. Is it based on regression? No, it's not based on regression. It's a simulation model. If you're interested, please do join us in January. Our conference will have a free workshop to teach about the software. My last question is about, can it be used to make counterfactual predictions? This is a very good question because currently our projection is deterministic, and we are now trying very hard to make it a probabilistic based in cooperation with the worldwide researchers. If you're interested, please join us for the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we actually have more time. I thought we should end by 5:20, but the schedule says it's until 5:30. So I think we can go back to Professor Adserà. Questions for Professor Adserà. I think the last question was about out of education, culture, and economic backgrounds, which factor do you think has affected the low fertility rate of Korea the most? So is it because of higher education or cultural change? Or more economic issues?
Well, I'm not an expert in Korea, so I guess what it would be, you are more the expert in Korea than myself. I could just think about guessing. When you really think about data on growth, and when I teach my students about models of economic growth, there was all this literature looking at the miracle, the Asian miracle. And then you go back to the data, and in fact, there's all this work looking at not necessarily increases in total factor productivity, but a huge increase in actually changing factors. And part of that was driven with a huge and very speedy increase in education of men and women, but women in particular. So I think the big jump in education in Korea, starting in the late 50s into the 70s, that was a big change that then affected all these cohorts that we are seeing now with lower fertility, but at the same time, social norms didn't catch up at the same speed that those inputs were changing. And so I think the culture is an important part. Though in some things, I think they are good news. When you look, for example, at sex ratios in Korea, they have really gone down to more normal levels. I think there's an improvement in the value of women and in the fact that actually this is maybe related to also changes in the welfare state and provision of pensions that have helped ease the pressure on some preference and have enabled then the role of women in the family. So I see that all in good directions. I think what concerns me is the work culture in the, and that I think is more exacerbated potentially in Japan. The long hours, the commuting costs, the expectation of raising one perfect child, which, you know, by having 3 children, none of my children is perfect. There's not such a thing as a perfect child, and everybody strives for that. I think that part of the culture is an important part, and I think it overburdens people with their expectations and with the idea of the cost. So thinking about cost of raising children is an important part also in the picture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have one follow-up question. So I guess at some point, women in Korea, they were educated, but then the cultural change didn't follow that trend, and we had to, you know, fight with some of the discrimination and also very little work-family balance. So a lot of family responsibilities as well as work responsibilities.
Exactly.
But in the future, if those cultural or social structural changes occur, do you think fertility will go up again, or is it something?
I think it may. I mean, it's debatable, because one of the things we've seen, for example, in China is this debate whether fertility preferences are going to go up now, even with the policy changes. So I have a student who graduated last year, and she's now moved to LSE, and she has a very nice chapter in her dissertation exploiting some of these changes in family policies and showing that indeed maybe there's hope. If we think that's hope, you know, it depends. Again, we are talking here about fertility, but we haven't really stated which is the goal. We may not want, you know, if we go back to thinking about climate change, maybe fertility increase is not the goal. So I mean, that's one thing that's been in the whole debate. The goal is not clear. So that's just for the record. But if the goal is thinking we want to increase fertility preferences may be on the margin increase. They are not going to go back to 3, but there may be some reversal when maybe the conditions match what women have in terms of thinking aspiration of reconciliation of family and work together. I've shown you that still in Europe, high educated women want children, but they do not achieve their preferred family size. And this is in part faced by the barriers they face in the labor market. And overall, the bad economic conditions that affect couples in terms of instability of their economic conditions. But yeah, I think there's a bit of room, not a huge room to grow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. For Dr. Lee, I wanted to ask you a question about the current debate over basic income. We often think that with the the introduction of technologies and more automation of labor force, we tend to think that there will be more people who are laid off, and so they need more social protection. But your research, I think, suggests the opposite. The implication is that the technologies can actually help people stay in the job. Do you think that that provides some different policy implications?
Actually, my research suggests that there are mixed effects on elderly people depending on the type of technological change. Some type of technological change absolutely, the reduced employment of elderly people, and some are sort of relatively reduced employment of elderly people. So it's the general effect is sort of the negative, in my opinion. But I don't believe that really suggests that we need a basic income. We need to think about whether it is an effective way of, reducing the difficulties of the individuals who are going out of the labor market because of the changes. And I, it will require too, much resources, too much government budget to deal with the problem. So, as a matter of fact, in Korea, the traditional welfare system has not been fully developed compared to other, developed countries. So I highly doubt that whether it is time to, introduce the basic income system in the current stage. Okay.
Thank you. For Professor Feng, I had one question about comparison between household approach and individualized population approach. So in Korea, there has been this notion that with the population decline, we will need fewer apartments, and so there will be decrease in prices. And nowadays, one of the hottest issue is increasing housing prices because of increased households, increased number of households, as well as other economic conditions. In China, do you think? So you talked about how increasing number of households can have negative implications for sustainable energy, but will increasing number of households, would they have also some positive implications for, retaining the infrastructure that we had for, China had a large population and it had built a lot of infrastructure. So I was just curious what you thought about that.
Yes, this is a wonderful question. Thank you, Professor Ha. Actually, I was only emphasized on one side to send out a warning that the per capita energy consumption will be less efficient. For example, for a couple to live together, they are going to use one refrigerator. And if they got divorced, and each of them will need one refrigerator. So clearly that solo living is not an ideal solution by sharing one refrigerator. But on the other side, you are very right. The implication could be much more complicated than that. For example, in the real estate industry, a number of households, increase. That means people will need more housing. But the housing may be small-sized rather than large-sized. Another implication will be vehicle, which is highly related to household structure. The ProFamy team has done a research project for General Motors for America. We do find that the large family will usually purchase a van or SUV. But solo livers will prefer much smaller cars. But whatever it is, it looks like the household trend will be creating a huge market for the automobile industry, because more people will live in a smaller household size, and the number of vehicles they will need will increase dramatically. And there's other kind of implications. For example, if people live in smaller household size, their leisure time may spend more in online, or have richer social life. They may go to the bar, at night rather than spending time at home. These are all interesting social implications of a smaller household size, which might not be completely negative, but I believe we need to be prepared for these very complicated social transformation, as you mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all for great presentations and discussion. We learned a lot from the presentations that you gave, and I'm sure our audience has enjoyed it as well. So it's almost time to close our webinar, and I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today, and to our speakers for graciously participating in our webinar. Hope everyone stays safe from COVID-19 and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.